Okay, today we are going to talk about participial phrases. Now, if you read through this by yourself, what you might notice is that a participial phrase looks kind of like in a positive. However, there is a main difference. Even though both of them modify nouns, a participial phrase begins like a verb. And that's basically the definition. If you look right here, a participial phrase is a phrase that looks like a verb, okay, but actually functions as an adjective. Right here, you can see it modifies a noun in the same sentence. And, well, it says phrases like this can spice up a noun or provide added description about what it's doing or what it looks like. Well, and a positive can do that as well. So what you're going to want to focus on is just the fact that a participial phrase, it begins like a verb. So if we scroll down here and we look at the examples, the nouns are in orange and the participial phrases are in green. Okay, so the participial phrase right here is fond of brushing her hair. And notice, just like in a positive, it's separated from the independent clause by a comma. What you should notice too here is that fond of brushing her hair is a dependent, or it looks like a dependent clause. Okay, now we call it a phrase because we're missing the subject. So we have a verb, brushing, we have the modifier, fond, and all of it is talking about Kelly. Okay, so that's why it's a participial phrase. If it was in a positive, it'd be something like Kelly, who constantly brushed her hair, always had smooth and silky locks. Okay, where Kelly would be separated from who was always brushing her hair by commas. Okay. Notice too that if you remove the green part, you have, if you start with Kelly, a full sentence right there. Kelly always had smooth and silky locks. So that makes up an independent clause. Kelly is the subject because Kelly always had. So there's our verb phrase. And then we have our participial phrase, where Kelly is modified by fond of brushing her hair. If you look in example 2, you see the participial phrase at the end, but once again, it's separated from the independent clause by a comma. So notice that while it modifies the subject of the independent clause, it is not necessary to complete the sentence. It's there, like it said above, to spice up or to describe the subject. Okay? Brimming, like it says right here, is a verb, but again, the phrase acts as an adjective because it describes what the trash can is like. So that's what it really boils down to here, is that participial phrases describe what the noun is, okay? So they describe what the noun is like an adjective, but they begin with a verb. Okay, we have an example here of, I'll scroll up here. So we're getting into more technical, sorry, first time using this, so it's a little touchy. What we're looking at here is the present and past participle. Okay, now that sounds really fancy, but if you look here, we start with an infinitive, which is just to plus a verb. So to smile or to hang. So the present participle is just smiling, or past participle is smiled. Okay, same with hanging, and then we get the funny word here, hung, where it's actually used correctly. It's very rarely used correctly, but here it is used correctly because hung is a past participle. Now, notice in example 1 here. So when we have the verb to smile, as it is above, okay, so it's right there, but we turn it to the present. So the woman, smiling and waving, said hello. Now, if you're paying attention, that looks like in a positive because you have the subject, which is a noun, and you have the subject being modified by a non-essential part of the sentence, smiling and waving, and then said hello completes the sentence. The reason that the green part here that I'm highlighting is a participial phrase and not in a positive is because it's a verb. Okay? And that's really all it is. Down here, framed and hung, both verbs. They modify the painting. Okay? And there is the example of Kelly again here. Okay? Now, if you read this, where a participial phrase sometimes uses a noun depending on the participle. This is just a simple example, but we're getting into dangerous territory here because look how far the participial phrase is from the noun. So we have the noun starts the sentence, and then the participial phrase is at the end of the sentence. Okay. It's okay to do this, but it can be dangerous. Okay. And we'll look about why that can be dangerous for meaning here in a few minutes. Number 2 is another example. I want to skip that one though. So when we go to modifiers, like it says here, a modifier will modify a noun just like the name says. But a lot of different words can modify these sort of things. We have adjectives, adverbs, even participles. Okay. As long as they're a part of the phrase modifying the noun. Once again, modifiers just add more detail. So they can be used in participial phrases to describe more of the situation. Okay. So pretend quickly, which I'll highlight, isn't there for a minute. Opening the bag would still work as a participial phrase. Opening is a verb. So we have the participial phrase, but quickly just modifies opening the bag. Okay. It works as an adverb because it's a word describing the noun. Or I'm sorry, the word describing the verb, which is acting like an adjective. Either way, it's an adverb because adverbs modify verbs. Adverbs modify adjectives. They also modify other adverbs. Okay. Now, here's the part where we can kind of check our work. Okay. So if you're comfortable with participial phrases, there's ways to make sure that we're using them correctly. Again, it comes back to the comma use. Okay. If you start a sentence with a participial phrase, you have to use a comma because you have to set it apart from the main clause because it's non-essential. Okay. Now I know it says here, but when your participial phrase describes the word right in front of it, you don't need commas. Pouring a glass of milk, Amanda concentrated. Yeah, that doesn't make a lot of sense. Okay. Again, example 2, much better. Amanda concentrated is technically a sentence. Pouring a glass of milk shows what she's doing. Okay. We know it's a participial phrase because pouring is a verb. Okay. It's a phrase that begins with a word that's a verb normally, but that also describes the noun. Okay. Here's the big one. B, avoiding dangling modifiers. This is what I was talking about earlier. When you put the participial phrase a long way in the sentence away from the noun that it's modifying. Okay. It makes the sentence sound funny. So the example here is the cup of water spilled everywhere and Connor walked over to clean it up, dripping over the sides of the table. I think logically we can figure out that the water is what spilled over the table. However, since Connor right here is the last noun that we're referencing, the sentence gets a little confusing because it actually seems like it's talking about Connor dripping over the sides of the table. I think obviously we can figure out what's dripping, but again, it's just a bad sentence. We can write that a lot more clearly, and you can see it more clearly in example 2, where it says the cup of water spilled everywhere, dripping over the sides of the table, and then we get to Connor, and Connor walked over to clean it up. Okay, so now we have the separation of the two nouns, the cup of water and Connor. And we know obviously that it is the cup of water that spilled everywhere because we have our participial phrase that tells us so. Okay. All right, here's the last part. So a gerund looks like a participial phrase, okay, but it does something different. Gerunds are verb phrases that act as nouns, while participial phrases act as adjectives. So take a look here. Turning the light on is a necessity at night. So no, turning is a verb normally. However, the action here, turning the light on, is actually the subject of the sentence. So it gets confusing. This is why we try to avoid these when we write, because it's just a little weird. Okay. Like it says here, we can tell this is a gerund because the phrase acts as a noun in the sentence, and then the rest of the sentence describes the gerund. Okay, and the rest of the sentence would be this part that I'm highlighting, is a necessity at night. Okay, this can be confusing. Gerunds are confusing just inherently. If you want to make sure that you're writing a participial phrase, take a look at example 2. Okay, we have our subject, who is a person that's doing the walking. Okay, so we have Haley walks into the room. That's our independent clause. But our participial phrase, again, turning is normally a verb. So we have a phrase here that's modifying what Haley's doing. So turning the light on, comma. So we know it's either in a positive or a participial phrase. So we can look at the beginning. Does it begin with a word that's normally a verb, and does it describe the noun? Yes on both ends. So we have a participial phrase. Okay. I'm not going to read the rest of this to you. There are examples here that you can go over, and I would test your knowledge too. Don't worry about the markings there. They're just there when you start. Take the quiz. You should be able to get all 4. And on B day, we're going to take a look at more participial phrases, and we're going to basically look at examples, and we'll fix them, or you'll tell me if they're right or not. All right. Thank you. This is our first, what am I using? Screencast-O-Matic. What a great name. First time we've done this. Hopefully it works out. I will see you soon.